So the short version of the comparison could basically be, well, the RTX 3070 MSRP is 25% more. It only gets about 17% more performance on average. So obviously, stupid buy, just get the 3060 Ti. Well, not exactly. So first of all, on the actual market, if I tried to buy these today, right now as of the time of filming, the interesting thing about the market is that a lot of times it actually does kind of adjust to these relative performances, at least as long as you're within the same brand like NVIDIA. So for example here, if it's $580 versus $500, that is more like a 16-17% performance gain for about that same amount of price difference. But it's actually true lately that on usually Thursday mornings, I think, although occasionally I think you get them at other times, Best Buy, at least in the United States, does have the Founders Editions come out at MSRP, and they've been a lot easier to get lately. I was actually able to get a 3060 Ti Founders Edition fairly easily for the actual MSRP of $399.99. And if I look at that compared to $580, well, this seems like a no-brainer. Or, you know, even compared to the $500, again, but wait, even if you could get them at those prices, what does a percentage really mean? So let's jump into some side-by-side benchmarks so you can actually see in a whole bunch of games at 1080p, 1440p, 4K, ray tracing, DLSS, all of that, what are the actual frame rates that you're getting side by side? I'll give you some final thoughts at the end. All right, we'll start out with Cyberpunk 2077 at the 1080p Ultra settings. Now, I do want to mention one reason why I choose this game, and obviously we're going to benchmark a lot of other games as well, but Cyberpunk still has one of the highest demands on graphics cards of any recent game that we've seen. So I like to use this as a bit of a look into what games coming out in the next couple of years as graphics demands get a little bit higher. You know, what kind of workload might we see coming here? So a lot of GPUs struggle even at 1080p Ultra settings in this game, but we can see here that the 3060 Ti and the 3070 both deliver very good frame rates. Now, it's also important to know that, you know, the 3070 is delivering significantly noticeably better frame rates, but I would consider both of these a high refresh rate experience, and this is at the Ultra settings. You could obviously turn things down a little bit if you needed to further increase the performance. But both of these are crushing a demanding 1080p game very, very easily. But what if you want to turn on ray tracing? Now, so here we're looking at two things. We're seeing the just ray tracing with the reflections turned on. Now, the ray tracing settings in this game have the Ultra settings, and then they turn ray tracing on top of that. So on the left here, we're seeing the ray traced reflections only, whereas on the right, we're seeing RT Ultra. And we actually see both GPUs are really struggling with RT Ultra settings, whereas with RT reflections, they're able to deliver playable performance, although the 3070 has a much easier time staying above 60 FPS with the RT reflections. So here I'd say that, you know, while the difference between these two GPUs isn't massive, ray tracing still is an incredibly demanding setting. So if you're wanting to use it, we can still see even the 3070 dip below 60 FPS, even just with RT reflections on here. If you're wondering why not DLSS, you could use it at 1080p. Personally, I don't think it looks great at 1080p. Now looking at 1440p, we're going back to no ray tracing, but we can see that at the maximum settings in this game, without ray tracing, the GPUs are actually both struggling in the more demanding scenes, whereas at the high settings, they are both doing a lot better. So again, thinking of Cyberpunk, I know I'll see comments, it's just an unoptimized mess. Well, I'd love to be benchmarking some kind of, you know, heavy-duty Unreal Engine 5 game or something like that to predict future GPU demands. But we just have yet to get those games out there. So again, using this as kind of a worst case scenario in the sense that I think this does give us an idea of what upcoming titles might be doing. So if you're buying a 3060 Ti now, Will it be able to handle everything at 1440p Ultra, in the next couple of years? We're seeing no, and even the 3070 could struggle a little bit, but that's trying to max out the settings, and it's also not using DLSS, which obviously could be used to boost performance, which is what we're going to take a look at right here. So in this one, we're seeing the basically using DLSS versus turning down settings, and both GPUs have this option. So if we want to keep at the ultra settings, by using DLSS Quality, we get enough performance boost that we did see the 3060 Ti have a few little minimum frame drops below 60 FPS, but for the most part staying well above it. Whereas, the performance, it's actually really interesting if you compare the 3070 with the 3070 here and the 3060 Ti with the 3060 Ti here, how close their performance is using Ultra with DLSS versus using just the high setting in terms of the performance gain that you get. It's not identical, and it varies a bit from scene to scene, I guess, as the exact demand between the ultra and high settings change. But it is pretty interesting to look at. Now, whether you prefer the look of turning down to high versus using DLSS might be a bit of a personal preference thing here. Now, what about trying to ray trace at 1440p? Well, if you're not willing to use DLSS, even the RT low settings are really too much for these GPUs to handle unless you're wanting a 30 to 45 frames per second experience. Whereas if we use DLSS Quality, we're able to get more playable frame rates. Although, once again, the little bit of extra headroom on the 3070 is certainly helping it stay above 60 FPS more of the time, whereas, the 3060 Ti has more scenes where it's dipping below that number. Now, 60 FPS is only a magic performance number if you have especially if you have a monitor that's just locked at 60 FPS. If you have a variable refresh rate monitor, then some dips into the mid-50s is a lot less noticeable. But either way, I'd say that both GPUs are struggling to ray trace at 1440p, even using DLSS. The RT low settings really don't do a lot, image quality-wise anyway. Now, if we're looking at these at 4K, really at native 4K, going down to the medium settings was the only thing that could get me something kind of playable, not that I'd actually use it. Whereas if we use DLSS, I think at 4K, if you're trying to use either of these cards for 4K, you would want to be using DLSS here. Now, notice that on the 3070, if we look at the right there, I'm using DLSS Quality at the high preset, whereas on the 3060 Ti, I'm using it on the medium preset, and the 3070 is actually still performing slightly better here. I'll admit that one reason why I'm not matching those quality settings is because I apparently, when I did all my recordings of things, I thought I was recording them the same, but I did one at high and one at medium there. I didn't have matching footage, but I thought this is actually an interesting comparison as it is, because you can see that one of the differences between buying a more powerful GPU is turning up the settings, even if it gets you about the same frame rate. Now let's look at some other games, because Cyberpunk isn't everything. How about Red Dead Redemption 2? Now when I say the max preset here, and again this is starting with 1080p, I mean taking the overall favor quality versus favor performance slider and sliding it all the way to the right, rather than playing with the individual settings, which there's a lot of in this game. Now we see both GPUs delivering a very solid 1080p, fairly high refresh rate experience here. So I think you'd be happy with either of these GPUs for 1080p in this game, no question. But if you want to turn it up to 1440p, the demand certainly does increase. Now in this interior scene, it's certainly one of the easier scenes in the benchmark, but as we get outside, both GPUs are going to do well at the maximum preset, but we'll certainly see it be, less of a high refresh rate experience, although I think we do still stay up in the upper 60s to low 70s most of the time, even on the 3060 Ti. So I think once again, you'd be very happy in this game on either of these GPUs, even trying to max out the settings. And of course, you can also turn down the settings if you're the kind of person who needs 100 FPS or something like that. Now, if we try to use 4K in this game, neither GPU can really handle the maximum settings. Even in this interior scene, we're dipping well below 60 FPS, especially on the 3060 Ti. But when this game came out, the Hardware Unboxed YouTube channel came out with some really good optimization settings. And if we try those out, the 3070 is able to still dips below 60, but stays close, whereas the 3060 Ti is still struggling. So this game does feature DLSS. So in this case, you'd probably want to be turning down settings and using DLSS. And that seems to be the case with 4K on these GPUs. These would really not be the ideal 4K graphics cards. Not that you couldn't try to use them, but I think it would make a lot more sense to just buy a higher end GPU. Now, if you have a lower resolution PC monitor, and then you also have a 4K TV that you game on the couch sometimes, I think both of these GPUs could at least handle doing that. Now, let's look at a couple other games before we go here. How about Horizon Zero Dawn? This is a fairly easy to handle game, so I just threw in the 1080p Ultra and 1440p Ultra footage next to each other. I don't know why the 3060 Ti on the far right there seems a little bit fuzzy. Sometimes on my NVIDIA GPUs, when I capture this game, it occasionally seems like it captures at a slightly lower or wrong resolution. I don't know why, but at least the performance numbers do seem to match up. So I don't think it's causing any problems in terms of seeing what kind of performance we would get here. And both graphics cards are delivering a very solid performance at both 1080p and 1440p. So I think you would be happy with either of those here. Whereas, of course, the 3070 is staying closer to that 100 FPS mark on the 1440p footage, whereas the 3060 Ti certainly dips below that. I mean, for me personally, on a high refresh rate monitor, especially in like a first-person game, around 90 FPS is kind of the magic number for me, where it feels about as smooth as it's going to feel. So if we look at 4K footage here, once again, we see that both of these GPUs can play games at 4K, although we see the 3070 able to hold closer to 60 FPS with just leaving it at the ultra settings, whereas the 3060 Ti, it's really dipping too far below 60 for me to be happy with, but this game, like many games now, does feature DLSS, so throwing on the DLSS Quality setting does still look very good, and now gets us solid 4K performance. And obviously we could have done that on the 3070 as well. Why am I not showing it? Well, when I had my 3070 in my PC, I didn't use DLSS on it because it was getting good enough performance without it. Although we do see it getting a few dips here below 60 FPS, and there's certainly more demanding scenes in the game as well. So I wouldn't blame you at all if you used the DLSS quality on your 3070 here as well. And of course, you can also look at turning down some settings. Now, how about some Forza Horizon 5? So again, here we're looking at the 1080p and 1440p footage next to each other, because I think it's, not super interesting. Basically, we see that we can max the game out at 1080p and at 1440p, and stay with high enough refresh rates that I wouldn't see the point in turning settings down. In a game like this, I think being in the mid-70s or up, at 4K, at 1440p is just fine, and oftentimes we're well above that. Now, this is certainly a game where AMD GPUs benefit from smart access memory, but even though I have resizable bar turned on for these recordings, NVIDIA has not whitelisted this game. NVIDIA has to whitelist games for their resizable bar support, and it doesn't seem like NVIDIA ever does whitelist any games other than the initial 17 or so that they did at launch. So why do I keep complaining that in all my videos? I don't know. Maybe somebody at NVIDIA someday will get the memo that you should whitelist more games for a resizable bar when it increases performance. Anyway, here we're looking at 4K, and at this point the extreme settings do seem to be a bit too much. And so kicking the settings down to ultra does seem to get the job done on both GPUs here. Even the 3060 Ti, for the most part, staying above 60 FPS. Now, you see a little bit of a frame rate spike on the extreme settings there, and I'm wondering if that could be VRAM related. This game is certainly getting close to that 8 GB of VRAM barrier at the extreme 4K settings. And we saw that on both the 3070 and the 3060 Ti, whereas on the ultra settings, we didn't see as big of a spike there. So just something I'm curious about, although it does seem like for the most part, performance is pretty smooth, even at 4K extreme, without a lot of big spikes or dips or anything like that. So it seems like for the most part in this testing, the 8 GB of VRAM hasn't been too big of an issue, but we can certainly see it pushing up against the limits here in this game. Now, let's go ahead and look at Guardians of the Galaxy before we go. Once again, we can see the 1080p and 1440p footage at the maximum settings next to each other, since I once again thought it wasn't super interesting to basically just say, yep, they absolutely crush it at maximum settings at 1080p and 1440p in this game. This game, until you turn on ray tracing, is not particularly demanding. So maybe we should, turn on some ray tracing. This game has several ray tracing settings. They're all reflections related. It goes from high to very high to ultra, and then there's also ray tracing transparencies. And I've turned all of those on, and at 1080p, both GPUs seem to be able to handle it at the native resolution without requiring DLSS. This is a game where I think the ray tracing was originally designed with consoles in mind, which have very limited ray tracing capabilities, although the RT Max settings are above the console level ray tracing settings. At 1440p, the maximum settings proved to be a bit much, so you could either turn down from the maximum, or you could use DLSS Quality, which at 1440p does look pretty good and does get both GPUs well over the 60 FPS mark throughout this benchmark. So I think you absolutely could use ray tracing in this game, and we can see that it's a lot less demanding here than it was in Cyberpunk. So there's certainly a difference in the demand level from different games when it comes to ray tracing. Now, this game, again, isn't super demanding, so the 4K Ultra settings are fairly playable, although the 3060 Ti dips below 60 FPS at times, so throwing on DLSS Quality certainly fixes that, and then, of course, you could use that on the 3070 as well. So one of my takeaways here is that both of these GPUs are very good, although obviously they both have their limitations. So let's break this down a little bit by resolution and whether you care about ray tracing. So at 1080p, I think both of these GPUs do a very good job. I think you'd be happy with either one, in which case, if you're value conscious at all, I think buying the 3060 Ti for 1080p will give you a lot of headroom for the future, and you're not going to really miss what the 3070 had to offer, unless you're really into ray tracing, in which case I honestly think even at 1080p, both of these GPUs we saw struggling with heavy-duty ray tracing settings even at 1080p. Now, I didn't test them with DLSS enabled because personally I think if you're spending this much on a GPU, the image quality loss that you get from DLSS at 1080p, I can speak, is pretty noticeable to me at least. I think some other people are less sensitive to this, so maybe you would be willing to use it. But I'd say that, if you want ray tracing, every little bit of extra horsepower matters, and you might consider going higher even at 1080p than 3060 Ti. But personally, I wouldn't worry about it too much. I don't think you're missing out a lot on most of the visual gains that you get from ray tracing these days anyway. Now, if we jump up to 1440p, I think here we start to see, yes, the 3060 Ti still handles most games just fine. But if we look at, more demanding settings, if you want to max things out at 1440p, I do think the 3060 Ti is getting a little bit weak for what we might expect from future titles. So if you want to be playing the latest AAA games at their maximum settings, the 3060 Ti does seem a little weak here. Although DLSS can help out a lot here. And at 1440p in most games, DLSS does look good enough that I think the average person would be absolutely fine turning it on and saving themselves some money on their graphics card. The 3070 does get just enough little extra performance here that at 1440p, that might be nice to have. So, when you're buying a GPU, you can certainly look at the value proposition, but you're also buying a certain level of performance. And in a lot of cases, just buying the most performance that you can possibly afford before you reach absolutely absurd levels of diminishing returns, like with, the 30, I think it's around the 3080 Ti and then going into the 3090s where you really saw hugely diminishing returns this generation. Everything leading up to that is at least fairly reasonable for the amount of performance you're getting for the additional money that you're spending. So even going up to like a 3080 class card at 1440p could give you a lot more headroom for demanding titles. Although I think if you're willing to just turn settings down a little bit and or use DLSS, and you're not hung up on trying to get ray tracing at 1440p, at least in the more demanding ray tracing titles, then I do think either the 3060 Ti or the 3070 does fine, and saving the money on the 3060 Ti could certainly make sense if you're reaching your budget limit here. Now at 4K, I don't think either of these GPUs are a great choice, although you're certainly going to, notice the little bits of extra performance that you might be able to gain from using the 3070. I think that, once again, that this might make the most sense if you have maybe a 1080p or 1440p computer monitor, and I know a lot of people also will sometimes, play some controller-based games from their TV on their couch from time to time, but still running off of their PC. I think both these GPUs will do fine in that case, especially because if you're sitting further back, using DLSS even pretty aggressively looks pretty good, at least when I do that from my TV. So I think that could be fine. So these could easily handle some 4K gameplay with settings compromised and especially using at least some DLSS. But yeah, I wouldn't recommend either GPU for 4K here. So in that case, I'm going to say doesn't matter too much, although obviously buying more performance is a better idea at 4K. So the 3070 is the better choice here. Definitely. But I'd really recommend going up to the 3080 or even, waiting for the next gen of GPUs where hopefully 4K above 60 FPS gaming gets a little bit easier or maybe less expensive. Let's hope prices don't go absolutely nuts, and I hope all of you have an excellent day.